Makahanya haramita shingyo Genji boza gyojin hanya haramita jisho kengon gai guro esai gu yaku shari ji shiki fui gu gu fui shiki.
In the northeastern Buddhist tradition, the Buddha's enlightenment is commemorated at the beginning of December, which also coincides with the winter months. Unlike in the southern, more equatorial countries, where Wesak is commemorated or celebrated in May, with the Buddha's birth, the Buddha's enlightenment, and the parinirvana as well taking place at the new moon. In the north, obviously, the countries have seasons. There is the summer months with the increased light, and then there are the winter months as well with the increased darkness. And so, like a lot of northern countries, there is a festival of light that takes place at this darkest time of the year, around the winter solstice. And in the northeastern tradition, which is also the tradition for the Chinese Buddhism, and obviously Chan and Zen come from that lineage, the Buddha's enlightenment is always pictured, or often pictured, not being in the hot, sweaty jungle, but in the icy mountains of the north, where the snows are thick upon the ground. And it's in this spirit too that the Great Rohatsu sesshin also takes place. And the commemorative event is on the 8th of December. This is when, according to this northwestern tradition, or northeastern tradition, sorry, that the Buddha's enlightenment took place after sitting for 7 days and 7 nights on the morning of the 8th day, looking up into that clear, frosty morning sky, seeing the morning star. The great being, the great bodhisattva, became the Buddha. He awoke, realized that supreme and peerless enlightenment, and became the Buddha, which of course is the title, meaning the awakened one, because he had awakened to the true nature of things, the way things really are. And this event, as has already been mentioned, is commemorated through that Rohatsu week, and in Zen temples and Zen monasteries, this marks a particularly difficult and arduous sesshin, or retreat, that starts on the 1st of December and goes all the way through. And there is very little sleep, very few comforts. The monks and the nuns sit it through, and they're pushed, absolutely pushed to the limit, getting them to that point of really having to go beyond, which of course is the meaning of paramita, which means going beyond what I could feel that I can endure. And we may wonder why on earth it's actually like this. After all, surely the Buddha preached the middle way. Surely these sorts of high intensity, almost draconian privations are not in the Buddha's spirit. And certainly, when I remember coming into the Zen school, first of all, and reading some of the accounts of what take place at these sessions, and particularly the Rohatsu session, and also the one that comes afterwards in January, known as the Great Cold Session, there's no heating in those places. The doors and windows are wide open. The monks just have their robes, not particularly thick robes either, to keep them warm. They're all in bare feet. It's really, really tough. And the people who undergo it become quite nervous about the whole affair. And I really sort of felt, maybe this is going a bit too far. I remember the story of Bhikkhu Sona. This is from the Buddha's own time in the Pali Canon. One of those classic stories teaching about the middle way. Bhikkhu Sona, who was a very ardent and zealous monk, and there he was in his little meditation hut out in the jungle, working very hard in order to gain arhatship, so much so that the little walking track that he used for his walking meditation was flecked with his own blood, where he'd worn the skin down. And having really propelled himself in this manner, he'd come to a point of burnout, and now had collapsed and gone into exactly the other way, and now fallen into a bit of a depression, realizing that nothing particularly had happened. He had begun to have doubts. Maybe this wasn't the life. Maybe this wasn't the best way that he could usefully live his life. He had come from a wealthy family himself, and he thought perhaps he should go back, take over the family business, and that way he could practice charity towards others, for example, as a good householder. And as he was thinking these things, the Buddha, the Lord Buddha, came past and, with his supernormal powers, saw into the heart of Bhikkhu Sona and realized that he was thinking of giving up this life, and so came, sat himself down, and said to Bhikkhu Sona, he said, I understand that you're having doubts about this life. And Bhikkhu Sona said, yes, Lord, I am. And the Buddha said to Sona, before you came here, is it not true that you were a lute player, a fine musician? And Sona said, yes, I was. So tell me, he said, if you over-tighten the strings of a lute, can you play a tune? No, he said, and if you have those strings too slack, can you play a tune? No, he said. But if those strings are tightened, neither too tight nor too loose, but according to harmonics, somewhere in between, how about then? Yes, of course, Lord, of course you can play a tune. It's the only way. And so the Buddha said, and so it is with these teachings. We are neither to give in to indulgence and laziness, neither are we to force ourselves into some kind of privation. Neither of these paths are useful to the practice, to the Buddhist, following the Buddha's path. I preach the middle way between those two extremes. And so hearing that, and armed with this idea of the mean, the average, the way between the two extremes, surely these great privations are not in the spirit of Buddhism. Well, of course, the middle way is a subtle teaching and has different levels of meaning. And whilst certainly on one level it avoids the extremes, on the other level that doesn't mean that the practice should always have exactly the same intensity all the way through. After all, to use an analogy in sports training or in Keep Fit, which a lot of people are into these days, if you go along to the gym and you go onto the running machine and you always set it to the same level and you always use it for this exactly the same number of minutes each time, well, to begin with, your fitness will increase, but then it plateaus. And in fact, after that, it begins to go down a little bit because the body is used to conserving energy and it finds ways of making things easier for itself, and so it will actually change the way that you run very subtly in order to conserve energy. And this is why the fitness level then begins to fall a little bit, because the body is not being stretched. In fact, the best way to train is to mix things up, and so one increases the difficulty a little bit, or one goes for a little bit longer, even if that means making the speed slightly less, or one speeds it up but runs for a shorter time. In mixing it up this way, it means that the body can never quite get comfortable with it, and so the fitness level actually increases. And so it is the same with the training as well. If we're always doing the same, making exactly the same effort, week in, week out, month in, month out, then very quickly it becomes, well, first of all, it becomes samey, and it then becomes half-hearted because I get bored with it. It becomes something of a chore. There's no challenge to it, really. So periods of relaxation and periods of intensity, together they form a new mean. Together they form a new middle way. And so these periods of more intense training are opportunities to really begin to test ourselves, to really test one's zazen strength, for example, to see that we can really hold together. And there's something else also to be said about this as well, that unless we do push ourselves a little bit, we never really discover what our limits are. very easily I become convinced that this is my comfort zone, this is what I can do, and no more. And of course, we have this featured beautifully in the Buddha's own life story. The beginning of his life, his father, well, literally imprisoned him in the palace. It was a gilded cage, there's no doubt about it. Everything that he could physically want lay within the palace. On the other hand, it was still a prison and he wasn't actually allowed outside. And the interesting thing about that, of course, is that even with all those things, that Prince Gautama was still dissatisfied and gave rise to an urge to go outside beyond the palace walls to actually see what there is. Some inner urge seemed to be prompting him here. And of course, if he hadn't done that, then he would never have had his great crisis, which catalyzed him setting out upon the spiritual life and becoming the Buddha and fulfilling his life story. So these gilded cages, because we may sort of think to ourselves, well, lucky for him, I wasn't born into a royal family. Most of us weren't. But whether we were or whether we weren't, the truth is that we spend much of our time building a gilded cage around ourselves. It's a cage of our own making. These are our comfort zones. These are the things that make my life comfortable, that help me feel secure and loved and happy and content. And that's fine. But what happens when one of those things is threatened? Well, for example, if the boss calls me in and then says, I'm sorry, we don't need you anymore, or the relationship breaks down, or heaven forbid, the doctor calls us and says we have those test results back and it's not good news. What happens then? Well, this is the point when Prince Gautama took those fateful trips outside of the palace, when he witnessed old age and sickness and death. Those are symbolic, of course. That old age, sickness and death, this is that moment when those things that we have relied on for our comfort and security suddenly give way, and the ground beneath our feet now suddenly looks very unsure and very unsteady. And we panic. Suddenly we become afraid. And why have we become afraid? Because we depended upon them, despite the fact that we live in a world in which everything is impermanent, and therefore there's nothing that can be depended on fully 100%. And so the Buddha doesn't promise us a happy ever after, but what he does promise us is that within each of us there lies the wonderful power and wisdom of the Buddha nature, and that the problem is not that we don't have the strength, but that we lack the faith in that strength. And why do we lack that faith? Because, as the Buddha says in the northern tradition, when he awoke, in the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, it says that when the Buddha awoke, he declared, "How wonderful, how miraculous! All beings, but all beings, are fully and completely endowed with the wisdom and power of the Tathagata," Tathagata being another name of the Buddha, of more intense training, which take us to that point. And getting us to that point means getting to the point of paramita. That is quite literally going beyond. Paramita means going beyond. And of course we remember there are those 6 paramitas. There's the paramita of giving, the paramita of discipline, the paramita of patient endurance, the paramita of vitality or devoted energy, and then those are those first 4 parameters provide the basis of our daily life practice, of our training. And then built on that edifice of those foundations are the final 2 parameters, which is meditation and also the prajna parameter, the wisdom gone beyond, which we chant in the Heart Sutra, Gate, Gate, Paragate, Parasamgate, Svaha, gone, gone, gone altogether beyond, over to the other shore, awakening fulfilled, enlightenment fulfilled. And this is the great wisdom of the Buddhas. And we may ask, what is that great wisdom of the Buddha? And Master Rinzai talks of it. In fact, he talks of it in the form of what's known as the supernormal powers. And in one interesting passage, Master Rinzai says, if you think it's the supernormal powers that make the Buddha, he said, well, remember the story of the demon king, who, when he was beaten by the great god Indra, hid himself and his 84,000 troops into the hollow stem of a lotus. If these sorts of supernormal powers are the Buddha's powers, then the demon king must be a Buddha. No, he said, the supernormal powers of the Buddha are particular to the Buddha only. And what are they? In the eye, not to be deceived by form. In the ear, not to be deceived by sound. In the nose, not to be deceived by smell, and so on, right the way through and in the in the heart, not to be deceived by mental configurations. And it's these mental configurations, what I think I am, what I think I can put up with, what I think my limits are, etc., what is capable, what I can stand, what I can't stand, what I can't live without, what I must have. These are the things that are restrictive. These are the things that tie us down, because we begin to defend them. If I feel I can't live without them, and then you come along and try and take them away from me, well, then you are my enemy, aren't you? And it's the same also with my opinions as well, because I become very attached to those, and they also become who I am. And so we have these two types of consciousness. We have a consciousness that tries to fix itself all the time, this consciousness that lives inside this gilded cage, that builds the gilded cage and tries to fix itself within them. It will not let go. And then there is this other one. We could call it the true state of affairs, the way things really are. This is another meaning of that term dharma. And that there's a consciousness in us that also knows this too, but it lies buried, and not having much faith in it, in our spiritual ice age, not having much faith in those things, having lost our faith in them, we fall back on the former, and we lose touch with the latter. And so that our practices really takes a path of emptying out that former consciousness, and diving deep into that latter one, deep into that consciousness that is empty of I, empty of all these attachments to I, me, mine, myself, what I want, what I believe, what my opinions are, and so on. And in that we discover something quite different. We discover quite a different life there, a much more spacious life, one that is much more connected as well. And we can wax lyrical on it endlessly, and of course the mystics and the poets do, but there's no substitute for actually tasting it for oneself, and that means really putting in some work. And so through this Rohatsu week, perhaps we can just think a little bit about how we can make that little bit of extra effort in our own training. To go a little bit deeper, not for myself, this isn't about me, it's about coming into the ambience of that which goes beyond I, and that means coming into that sea of humanity, into that sea of other things as well, into that sea of forming a relationship with that which lies beyond I. This is what simultaneously, in that giving myself away, what also liberates me as well from the constricture, from the separateness, from that prison of I that I seem to so willingly build around myself. So maybe that would be a little bit more zazen this week, or maybe a little bit of extra chanting, or even just a bit of extra quiet, and just remembering and reflecting on that great effort that the Buddha made, and on that great effort which is being made also in Zen monasteries around the world, even as we speak. So perhaps we can keep that in mind, and for these 8 days, or these 7 days and 7 nights, just make that little bit of extra effort in our own training to commemorate the great effort of that great bodhisattva when he sat down under the Bodhi tree, not for just his own benefit, but for the benefit of all beings, which includes us, of course. We'll leave it there.
Yate yate hara yate haraso yate boji soaka anya shin